Great to be here. First time speaking at this venue. Where should I stand? Maybe here. All right. So I have the hard task of making a really boring topic, which is regulation, interesting and entertaining to you. So I've put a lot of memes in the presentation, and I hope that will sort of smooth over the fact that regulation is inherently sort of a nerdy thing that lawyers love, but everybody else sort of doesn't like that much. So I was introduced. I would like to get to know my audience here. So please raise your hand if you've ever purchased cryptocurrencies in your life. Oh wow, almost the whole room. Very cool. Now raise your hand if you've ever created and sold your own cryptocurrency. Almost nobody. Nobody actually. Okay. Well, any of these things are now regulated in Europe. And Europe is really the first place in the world that is doing this, which is pretty cool if you think about it. Okay, I have the same slide-ish here. Okay, here it is. Before I dive into this, 2 words on the European Crypto Initiative, which is an organization that I co-founded 3 years ago when the EU set out to create the world's first comprehensive regulatory framework for cryptocurrencies. And we are sort of a grassroots organization. We fight for financial inclusion, decentralized technologies, and all these good things that are ultimately enhancing the sovereignty and influence of humans and communities. We're not really, lobbying for banks. That's, I guess, the other side of the spectrum of the kind of lobbying that you could be doing in this sector. So, okay. So why crypto regulation in the first place, right? And all of you that have been part of the early internet in sort of the 90s will be, thinking back when you hear this debate, well, crypto, it can make its own rules, it can be self-regulated, it's, disconnected from meat space, we don't want regulators here, all these things, that's sort of the narrative that we've heard over the past decade. But now, actually, I think this idea that code is law and we don't need regulation is sort of the mid-take. And actually both ends of the spectrum here, I think, agree that crypto regulation can actually be a positive thing. And I think the really smart take is that regulation can fix information asymmetries. And there are quite some information asymmetries in the crypto space. Many of you have probably heard of FTX, this big crypto exchange that went bust last year, and billions of dollars vanished, and many people lost their savings and all these bad things. And that's exactly one of the reasons why regulation can actually be a good thing for the space. But not all regulation, right? You need good regulation. So this is what Europe set out to do, and it has the name of markets in crypto assets. That's the name of this new law. It's sort of a riff on an existing regulation or directive that Europe has, which is the Markets in Financial Instruments Directive. And now we have the Markets in Crypto Assets regulation. Let's see whether this is any good. All right, so the scope and the timeline of MiCA. The overarching goal is to create a risk-based regime that balances a bunch of important things that are important for the European regulator. This is consumer and investor protection on the one hand, and I think we can all agree that this is something that crypto would benefit from. Financial stability and monetary sovereignty concerns on the other hand. And those of you who were part of this crypto bubble 2 cycles ago may remember that Facebook at some point had the idea of launching their own cryptocurrency. And that's actually the time when Europe started to look into creating such a regulatory framework. It's because Facebook said, hey, we have 3-4 billion users, why don't we just print our own money? And this is when the EU was like, well, that's probably going to be a problem for us, so let's create this framework. Facebook never ended up doing this because they got so much backlash. It was called Libra, then Diem. It never happened, but the EU pulled through, and now we have this law. MiCA basically applies to anything that you do in crypto, the issuance of your own coin, trading of tokens, providing any kinds of services around cryptocurrencies. So it's a pretty comprehensive, all-encompassing regulation. And it's, I think, quite relevant right now because just last month, this piece of law was published in the official legal journal of the EU. And that's sort of the last formal act that a law requires to be considered a law in Europe. So it's done. It's actually a law now. But it won't enter into force until 12 months from now or 18 months from now, respectively. So the two important dates, really, in case you are at all interested in doing something in the crypto Web3 space, is going to be June 2024, in case you want to issue a stable coin, right? So a token that is pegged to a fiat currency. This regulation is going to enter into force in June 2024, and then all the other good stuff in the MiCA regulation, provision of services, issuance of tokens, utility tokens, those sorts of things, that will start to be regulated in December 2024. So that's the timeline. What's the TLDR on MiCA? It's basically that crypto asset service providers, that's the new thing now, or CASP, we call them CASP in the industry. CASPs, like centralized exchanges, custodians for cryptocurrencies, and any other kind of service providers are now regulated, and you need a license for it, okay? To get a license, you need to talk to a regulatory authority, like a national competent authority. It would be BaFin in Germany, and so on. Exchanges are going to be liable for the losses of customer funds, which is great, right? That's, I think, what we would expect as consumers. The issuance of new cryptocurrencies will require a white paper, and that's sort of funny because in the financial world this is normally called a prospectus, but the EU wanted to be sort of edgy, and they sort of took the term white paper that the crypto bros made up and made it an official legal obligation. So we don't call it prospectus in crypto, we call it a white paper. That's sort of cool. Stable coins, because of this Libra Facebook currency background, are actually the biggest thing in this whole piece of legislation. It's like dozens of pages of rules just on the issuance of stablecoins. And if you think about it, it makes sense because stablecoins can really, you know, I guess, endanger the monetary sovereignty of the European Union. And Europe famously is now also working on its own digital euro, so its own digital coin, its own digital money. So this is where really the heavy regulation in this legislation lies. And we also got a new supervisory architecture, so the ESMA and the EBA, these two authorities in Europe, play a vital role in the crypto regulation going forward. MiCA enforcement, what is this going to look like? Well, first of all, it's a regulation, not a directive. That's a big difference. A directive is a European law that needs to be transposed into national law in all member states. This is not what MiCA is. MiCA is a directly applicable law in all of Europe. It immediately applies verbatim in every country equally. ESMA and EBA, just mentioned them, they are currently drafting a lot of second-level rules because MiCA contains a lot of things like, yeah, ESMA will specify the guidelines for what a white paper, if you want to issue a cryptocurrency, has to look like. So that's actually not really in this regulation. This is a sort of secondary piece of legislation that these authorities are currently busy drafting. So this stuff is still going on. Ultimately, it will be the national competent authorities like BaFin and so on that will make a decision of whether you will get a license or not. So this is sort of a division of power between the European and the national regulators. And once you have a license to issue a cryptocurrency or run an exchange, you can do this in all of the EU, right? So this is the benefit of Europe. It's sort of a harmonized market. You get the permission to do something in one country, you can passport it, that's sort of the term for it, to every other country. All right, so what's the good, what's the bad stuff? The good stuff is, I think, that we have the most comprehensive regulation of crypto worldwide in Europe now. There is not another block of countries or a single country that has anything comparable. And if you've been in Brussels anytime in the last couple of months, you would have seen delegations from the United States, from the United Kingdom, from Japan, from other countries come to Europe to meet the European legislators and ask them all the questions. How did you do it? What were the important things? What works? What doesn't work? So actually Europe is now the regulatory hub of the world for this new industry. That also means that Europe is open to crypto businesses, unlike the United States. If you're in the United States right now and you want to do anything in crypto, you really have a problem. And Europe is, I think, really in a better place than the US here at the moment. And you can actually see this when you look at the statistics of capital allocation by investors by country. And Europe has basically caught up with the US, and there is now just as many funded startups in crypto in Europe as there are in the US, and that has never been the case. The US has been leading this by a long stretch, but this is over now. And I think maybe the best thing about MiCA is what's not inside of it, okay? And that's basically decentralized finance and NFTs, two really interesting innovations that crypto people came up with that are still very nascent technologies and industries. They are actually not regulated by this legislation. The legislation really focuses on centralized services that contain these information asymmetries that I mentioned initially by definition. A fully decentralized system is ideally actually not impeded by information asymmetry in between its users, so it will actually need a completely different regulatory framework, which is what Europe is working on now. But this is going to take another 2 years to hit, so we have some time to come up with good ideas how to regulate truly decentralized applications of this technology. What's the bad stuff? Well, I think that stablecoins now have a very limited design space, and that's sort of a pity, because stablecoins have been probably the biggest, the most mainstream product that crypto has come up with. It's an incredibly versatile and useful technology to be able to send fiat currencies in a digital way in seconds all across the planet. Even the United Nations has been sending relief, financial relief to refugees from the Ukraine war as stablecoins, right? So if you're somewhere in the world and you don't have access to banking, you can still receive digital dollars, you can receive digital euros. So it's a massive innovation, but it's now also massively, heavily regulated, and it's really hard for a startup now to just, try something out. So I think that's not necessarily a good thing. There is no definition of what a decentralized service actually is. And that sort of counteracts what I just said before, which is that DeFi and NFTs are not part of the scope of this regulation. Well, in order to know whether you are actually a centralized or a decentralized application, you would sort of need an operational definition of what decentralized is. But the EU was never able to come up with that. So actually, if you're a builder in the space and you're running a service that is decentralized, you really don't know if you fall into the scope of the regulation right now or not, because there is no real definition of decentralized. I'm totally over time, so I unfortunately cannot go into this stuff right now, but you should check out recital 22 of the MiCA regulation. It's really interesting because this is sort of the place where this differentiation between are you in the scope or outside of the scope of this regulation is put down. All right. Some outcomes of this is that progressive decentralization, as proposed by, Andreessen Horowitz and other big investors in this space, is basically dead. You cannot progressively decentralize your application anymore. You're either fully decentralized or you're not. And this whole decentralization theater that we've seen in the past in crypto is going to end in Europe. You have to really be decentralized. So I think if you want to be decentralized, your most important asset is going to be your community going forward. I think community is the most important thing, and I should just stop talking. So thank you very much for listening.